to Luxor, where we continue our story of ancient Egypt. In our last program, we showed you the mighty monuments of the Pyramid Age. So let's just first refresh our memory as to how it all ended. Firstly, there was the destruction of Egypt's farms and flocks by the 10 devastating plagues. Then the annihilation of the Egyptian army in the waters of the Red Sea in the Exodus. And finally, the collapse of power of the 12th dynasty. Egypt was then occupied by the mysterious Hyksos, who were later driven out of Egypt. And the kings of the 18th dynasty ushered in a glorious era of prosperity and power.
Well, it was probably Seqenen-Re of the 17th dynasty who started the War of Liberation against the Hyksos. And how it all started is really rather ludicrous. You wouldn't believe it. A delegation came from the Hyksos king way down there in the delta, some 700 kilometres away. And this delegation came up here to Luxor and said, look, you are digging a canal, and there are hippopotami in this canal, and their grunting at night is keeping the Hyksos king awake. Well, Seqenen-Re had to do something about it, and so he politely said, all right, I'll do something. But after they went, I can just see him turning to his courtiers and saying, listen, you fellas, I've had it. That's the last straw. I'm going to drive these fellas out of the land of Egypt. And so the War of Liberation started. Well, Seqenen-Re was not successful. In fact, if you look at his mummy in the Cairo Museum, you find that it has 2 savage gashes in the forehead, and archaeologists have fitted a battle axe blade in there, and they find that it just fits perfectly. Apparently he died of a battle axe wound in this War of Liberation. But he was succeeded by his son, Kamoses, and by his brother, Ahmosis, and between them they successfully drove the Hyksos out of Egypt and off the pages of history. Well, they were followed by Amenophis I, and then Thutmosis I. Well, Thutmosis I started something new. You see, up until this time, all the previous kings had been buried in pyramids. But apparently Thutmosis I decided there was no future in that. They were being robbed and plundered anyway. And so he started a new idea. It's way over there on the other side of the River Nile. And it's called the Valley of the Kings, where this idea started. Oh, this is just beautiful. I love this scenery. I'm walking along 6 o'clock in the morning along the bank of the Nile here at Luxor. The reeds are floating down the river. Over there, see those hills? Well, over there is the Valley of the Kings. And that's where Thutmosis I started this new burial fashion. We're going to go over in a ferry and finish up in the Valley of the Kings right over there. Here we are looking down on the Valley of the Kings, and instead of building a pyramid for his burial place, Thutmosis had his workmen chisel a hole into the side of the valley, and there at the end of the passage he had a tomb chamber. Now, he was followed by other kings who did the same thing, and some of these tomb passages go 100 meters into the side of the cliff, and there are some beautiful paintings on the walls. At the end of the passage was a tomb chamber in which was a sarcophagus in which the king's mummy was buried. Well, Tutmosis I was responsible for this obelisk that you see behind me here, and it stands over 21 metres high. And if we are to accept the revised chronology of Dr. Emanuel Velikovsky, it's rather interesting to notice that Tutmosis I would be contemporary with King Solomon of Israel. All right, if that is the case, then this passage we find here in 1 Kings 3:1 is applicable. It says, "Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter." And so Solomon would have been the son-in-law of Tutmosis I. Now, this Pharaoh gave his daughter a very unusual dowry for her wedding. You'll never guess what it was. But I'm going to read to you from 1 Kings chapter 9 and in verse 16 where it says, "Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and taken Gezer and burned it with fire, had killed the Canaanites who dwelt in the city, and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife." Well now, if what I'm saying is correct, we should be able to find some evidence of Gezer being burned with fire. Let us have a look at the city of Gezer and the excavations there. It was built on this hill, and over the other side, the archaeologists have done some excavating. They have carved a deep trench which exposes the strata or layers of occupation. I went there and had a good look at these strata, and I found that there was a layer of ash there. Very heavy ash, in fact. I brought back some of the grains of wheat that had been burnt and carbonised. You can still distinctly see the little grains of wheat. So Gezer was thoroughly burned. All right, then who did it? I took some pottery from underneath this burnt stratum, and I showed it to one of Israel's top archaeologists for identification. He, without hesitation, said, "This comes from the early Bronze period." Now, that means, in my thinking, that this was the Canaanite occupation, and above it was the Middle Bronze, which I consider to be the Israelite occupation. So here we have the evidence at Gezer that the Canaanites were conquered at some time, their city was burned, and above it is the evidence of Israelite occupation. When Tutmosis I died, he was succeeded by his son, Tutmosis II. But this poor guy didn't last very long, only for another 4 years, and then he seems to have dropped dead. Well, he had no successor except his son by another wife, who was Tutmosis III. But he was only a boy, he was only a child at the time. And so the wife of Tutmosis II assumed the throne. Her name was Queen Hatshepsut, whose statue you see here. And Hatshepsut reigned for 21 peaceful and prosperous years. Well, she seems to have liked the job because she started off as a regent, but then this statue depicts her with a queen's attire, female attire. Now, this statue here depicts her as having male attire. Do you see that? In other words, she was assuming the role not of a queen now, but of a king, a pharaoh. And she took all the titles of a pharaoh. And her statues in the Cairo Museum actually depict her as wearing a beard. For instance, this statue and then this sphinx of her shows her with a beard. Now, you might say that's ridiculous, a woman wearing a beard. But you see, the pharaohs themselves were clean-shaven, and they simply stuck a beard on their chins for ceremonial occasion, and I suppose Hatshepsut figured if the men can do it, she can do it too. Anyway, that's what she did. Well, Hatshepsut built some tremendous obelisks. This one lying here is the biggest one in the land of Egypt at the present time. It's snapped in half, actually. And this other one that is standing over here is the largest standing obelisk in the land of Egypt, in contrast to her father's, Tutmosis, over there. Her obelisk is more than 30 metres high. She was also responsible for a magnificent mortuary temple. Well, Western people today are buried in holes in the ground like that, and then they put a tombstone on top. Well, this is Hatshepsut's tombstone. Only call it a beautiful mortuary temple. And I consider that she should be identified with the Queen of Sheba. You see, it says in 1 Kings chapter 10 and in verse 1, "Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions." Well, who was this Queen of Sheba? I don't think we should be in any doubt myself, because Jesus Christ identifies her. In Matthew 12 and in verse 42, he says, "Now when the Queen of the South came to hear the wisdom of Solomon," she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. He calls her the Queen of the South. Well, in Daniel chapter 11, we have the King of the North and the King of the South. And there, the King of the South is identified as the King of Egypt. And so if the King of the South is the King of Egypt, well then surely the Queen of the South must be the Queen of Egypt. And that is what Josephus, the ancient historian, says. He identifies her as the Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia. Here is Hatshepsut's mother, and she's seated on the birth stool, and the baby will be placed here. And she depicts herself as being born in the presence of the gods. Here is the god Tot, here is the god Amun, and here was the baby being received by the gods. This was to establish her claim to the throne. This scene shows Hatshepsut's expedition to the land of Punt. You can see her soldiers with their shields standing on the deck of the ship, see the fish underneath, and they're going on this expedition to God's land. Here are her sailors pulling on the oars. You see the ship there and the mast. They're on the way to the land of Punt. Now up here are some trees and plants that this expedition brought back from the land of Punt. The archaeologists didn't know where the land of Punt was, and so they called on the botanists and said, "Listen, you fellas, can you tell us where these plants come from?" And the botanist said, "Sure, we can tell you. They come from East Africa, maybe Somalia or Eritrea." And so the archaeologists said, "Fine, now we know where the land of Punt is." But I think there's another explanation. Look at it this way. In 1 Kings chapter 10 and in verse 10 it says, "Then she," that is the Queen of Sheba, "gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in precious great abundance, precious stones, also the ships. And King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired. Also the ships of Hiram brought gold from Ophir, and great quantities of almug wood or trees, and precious stones from Ophir." Now you see, they actually brought these things from East Africa, and when the Queen of Sheba came there, she said, "Yeah, I want some of them." And so they brought them back, and I think that's why they finished up on this wall. There was something else that impressed the Queen of Sheba in her visit to Solomon. It says, "And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built," that's his temple, "and his entryway or his ascent by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her." You see, there was something about the way he went up to the temple that impressed her. And when you look at this, it seems to me that she came back and said to her workmen, "Now look, I want a temple built like that." This is unique, you see. There was never anything like this before in the land of Egypt. Now, it is true that most archaeologists identify Sheba with a city in southwest Arabia by the name of Marib. But for this, there is no inscriptional evidence to support it. Wendell Phillips, an American archaeologist, conducted an excavation there, very exciting really, and he wrote a book called Sheba's Buried City. Wonderful book, but there's no evidence to support this view that the Queen of Sheba came from southwest Arabia. But suddenly, Queen Hatshepsut disappears from the scene, and we suspect that her son-in-law, Thutmose III, whose relief is seen here, knew something about it. Because immediately we find him going round the land of Egypt, demolishing her statues and erasing her name from her inscriptions. Here was a relief of Hatshepsut seated upon her throne with her scepter in her hand. And Thutmose sent his workmen round here, and see how they've chiseled it all off. This was part of his rage to show his anger at being held back from the throne so long. So he became the mightiest of all the pharaohs. He conducted no less than 17 military campaigns, very successful. And he left some very fine statues of himself. For instance, there is this statue in the Luxor Museum and this very fine statue in the New York Museum. Thutmose was also responsible for this great festal hall here at Karnak, in which the archaeologists found a very important king list. He was also responsible for erecting 4 big obelisks. He depicts 2 of them on his wall over there. One of them has since gone to the city of London and stands on the Thames embankment. Another has gone to New York. Another one has gone to Istanbul, and the biggest of them all stands in front of the Church of St. John Lateran in Rome. It's 32.2 metres high and weighs 455 tonnes. It's an enormous thing, the biggest obelisk that was ever made in the land of Egypt. Thutmose III, whose relief you see here, left this record of his military campaigns. And he records here over 100 cities, each one depicted by this oval with the form on top, cities which he conquered in Palestine and Syria. At the top of this list, there is the city of Kadesh. Now, the word Kadesh means holy or holy city, and this could refer to Jerusalem. Now, if what we're saying is correct, this then is a record of the Bible story of Rehoboam being invaded by the Pharaoh of Egypt. And it says here in 1 Kings 14 and verse 25, "Now it happened in the 5th year of the king Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took everything away. He also took away the gold shields which Solomon had made." Now, Thutmose not only left a record of the cities he conquered, but he left a record of the loot that he took. And I want to show you that. It was on this wall that Thutmose depicted a list of all the loot that he took from his military campaign. Dr. Emanuel Velikovsky, who is of Jewish origin, has made a comparison between what was in Solomon's temple, according to the record of the book of Chronicles, and the items that are listed here, and he claims there's a very close similarity between those. For instance, you will notice up here the fire pans and the bowls, the dishes. There's something up here that looks very much like the Ark of the Covenant, with the poles through it by which the priests carried it. And there is an altar. It looks like a fire altar, such as would be expected from the temple in Jerusalem. And then there is this other altar up here. Well, it looks more like 7 lampstands. That sounds a bit familiar. In particular, look up there. There are 2 doors. Do you see that? And they're golden doors. And it says in 1 Kings chapter 6 and in verse 32, "The 2 doors were of olive wood, and he carved on them figures of cherubim, palm trees and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold." Golden doors. And so we have golden doors up here. Pharaoh Shishonk was the founder of the Libyan 22nd dynasty. And just around the corner here, he has left a relief which shows a list of cities that were in Palestine and Syria, and authorities have identified this list with the cities conquered by Shishak of the Bible. The list is somewhat similar, as you can see, these ovals with the heads on top, similar to the list that was left by Thutmose III. But I don't consider this to be a valid identification. If this really was the Shishak of the Bible, what city would you expect to find at the top of the list? Well, Jerusalem, of course, but Jerusalem is not even in this list. Moreover, authorities consider that this is not a historical list, for some of the cities mentioned here had ceased to exist by the time of Shishonk. The Mitanni, in particular, had been wiped out 400 years prior to this list. So I don't consider this to be a valid identification. Thutmose III had transformed Egypt from a nation into an empire by his military conquests. And from then on, the tribute flowed in from the surrounding nations, enabling the pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasty to build such massive temples and monuments. He was followed by Amenhotep II, or Amenhotep II. And he left a rather interesting statue, which is today in the Cairo Museum. and it depicts him as a devotee of the cow goddess Hathor. Up the front end, you see him under the protection of the cow goddess, and at the other end, well, he's drawing nourishment hot off the grid from this deity. After Amenophis II came Thutmosis IV, and he has left rather an interesting stele between the paws of the Sphinx. He records there how he was to become the pharaoh as the result of a dream he had in which the Sphinx appeared to him and said, "If you'll only clear the sand that is stifling me, I'll make you the next pharaoh." Now, some people have read a lot into this and tried to make out that he was made the pharaoh as the result of this dream. Well, I don't consider that to be plausible. It was simply a device the pharaohs had to the throne as a divine right, and so he simply claims that the Sphinx appeared to him and spoke to him. Well, he was followed by Amenophis III, sometimes referred to as Amenophis or Amenhotep the Magnificent, because of his tremendous building program. And the largest statue in the Cairo Museum depicts Amenophis III and his wife with her arm affectionately round his waist. The magnitude of his building projects can be gauged from these two colossal statues of Amenophis III, which once stood at the entrance of his great temple here at Luxor. To give you some idea of the enormous magnitude of this temple, do you see that stele away back there? Well, that marked the rear end of the temple, which stretched right forward to those two huge statues known as the Colossi of Memnon, which marked the front of the temple. Around the other side of this statue of Amenophis is a small statue of his mother, Matamwa. And on this side is a statue of his wife, T. Now, she's a bit cut down to size, of course, but anyway, he was apparently very devoted to her because she appears in so many statues, and it's a little difficult to understand why. If we go by a statue of her in the Berlin Museum, she is not exactly beautiful. But anyway, maybe she had a nice personality or something like that. Now, round the side of this statue, there is a very interesting symbolism. Can you see here two figures? And they're both of the river god Hapi, representing Upper and Lower Egypt. And do you notice how they're sort of tying something together? Well, after all, that's what the river Egypt does. It binds Upper and Lower Egypt together. And so this is a very fitting symbolism of the unity of Egypt, which the pharaohs tried to attain, and the river god Hapi binding Upper and Lower Egypt together. Now we come to a really intriguing era of Egyptian history. Following Amenophis III came his son, Amenophis IV. And this character adopted a new form of religion. He began to worship the sun god under the form of the god Aton, the sun disk. And he changed his name from Amenophis, which included the name of the god Amen, to Akhenaton, which incorporated the sun disk Aton. And his reliefs show him as worshipping this sun god. For instance, in this relief, which is in the Cairo Museum, we see him standing with hands upraised, worshipping Aton. And Aton, on the other hand, is reaching down its arms in extended blessing with hands outstretched upon the pharaoh and his wife. Now, Akhenaton was a grotesque figure if we're going to go by his statues. Thick lips, thin cheeks, protruding belly, thick thighs. Did he really look like this? Or was it a new art form? There's a lot of advocates of the latter theory, actually, but personally I don't think anyone would want to be depicted like this unless he was really like this. It is true that the other members of his court also adopted a similar art form, but I think that was just following the fashion. Anyway, Akhenaton had some strange statues of himself. For instance, there's this one that shows him without any clothing on. Well, now, this was abnormal for a pharaoh. They were always modestly dressed. And this has given rise to a lot of speculation just why this should be. Was it because he was like this? Actually, you'll notice that something else is missing too. And this has led to suggestions that he was not able to procreate. But we do know that he had 6 daughters. You might say they were adopted. But if the pharaoh was going to adopt any children, you tell me, what would they be? Well, of course, they'd be sons. So it's quite apparent that he was able to procreate. Well, his beautiful wife, Nefertiti, has her statue made, and this head of her is in the Berlin Museum. It's a beautiful statue. I went to Berlin just purely and simply to see this statue, and I wasn't disappointed. And the extraordinary part is that it depicts her as blind in the left eye. Do you see that? Now, this has led to a lot of speculation too. Was she really blind, or didn't the artist finish his work? Or was the statue mutilated afterwards? Well, personally, I think that she did become blind in the left eye. And that would explain why she had a separate palace built for herself. Apparently, Akhenaton still loved her, but maybe he didn't want her as the retaining queen. And so, not wishing to banish her and yet not wishing to retain her, he built this separate palace for her down the other end of the new city that he'd built, Archaeological, halfway between Memphis and Thebes. Now, Akhenaton apparently went through a very strange phase towards the end of his reign. And I think that is the reason that he is depicted in that statue that I showed you. Perhaps even, as some have suggested, he developed homosexual qualities. Whatever it was, his was an extraordinary reign and a strange era in Egyptian history. Akhenaton was followed by his younger brother, Tutankhaten, and he reverted to the religion of Amun, and so changed his name to Tutankhamun. In 1922, Howard Carter made the spectacular discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. It's way down there in the valley, and later on in this series we're going to have a full program on Tutankhamun. You want to stay around for that, it's exciting. Tutankhamun was succeeded by Ai and then by Horemheb, who went round the land of Egypt smashing all the statues of Akhenaton and demolishing all his temples. So this is where the archaeologists have stacked the stones from Akhenaton's smashed temple. And from the beautiful reliefs you can see what a magnificent temple it was. This is the way the 18th dynasty came to its end. Ramesses I is usually considered to be the first king of the 19th dynasty. And he was followed by Seti I, and then came Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great. And Seti and Ramesses II were responsible for this huge hypostyle hall, 134 massive columns in this great hypostyle hall. Ramesses was really great because he was a compulsive builder, and he also fought the famous Battle of Kadesh depicted on his reliefs. He was often rejoiced to be able to tell about the Battle of Kadesh. And if you still don't think Ramesses was great, just consider this. He had 92 sons and 106 daughters. And if that doesn't make a man great, you tell me what does. Well, Ramesses also was responsible for the magnificent temple of Abu Simbel. And there also he depicts his battle against the Hittites at Kadesh, and we will have more to say about them in our next program. But Ramesses also made provision for his death. This is the Ramesseum, which is his mortuary temple, still in remarkably good condition. Even the roof is intact. And lying on the ground, you can see a statue of Ramesses, which is the biggest statue in the land of Egypt. You can get an idea of the enormous size of this statue by just looking at the feet. Well, Ramesses the Great died, of course. He ruled for 67 years. And that is his mortuary temple away over there in the distance. And he was succeeded by his son Meneptah. Now, Meneptah left a stele, which is very important, just for one word that occurs on it, the word Israel. It's the only place in all the land of Egypt that the word Israel occurs. Now, Meneptah is not saying that he conquered Israel. He's simply recording a historical fact. He says, Israel is destroyed, her seed is no more. And personally, I consider this refers to the Assyrian invasion of Palestine and the exile of the 10 tribes of Israel into Assyria. We are at Medinet Habu, a temple of Ramesses III. And in this relief that you see here on the wall, Ramesses has his club lifted and he's about to bash somebody's brains out. And he is depicting here his battle with what are referred to as the peoples of the sea. Now, this battle is supposed to have occurred around 1200 BC. But there's some awkward anachronisms involved here by this present dating. One is, for instance, that Ramesses III is supposed to be repelling these peoples of the sea who swept over Anatolia around 1200 BC and annihilated the Hittites. But we have a relief of Shalmaneser III in his obelisk in which he refers to his battle with the Hittites. So here you are in the 9th century BC, and here's Shalmaneser fighting the Hittites, who are supposed to have been extinguished 1200 BC. You see, it just doesn't fit. And then too, in this gateway over here, there is obvious Assyrian influence. And you've got to date that to either the 8th or the 9th century BC. So where did Ramesses III get this concept from? Well, you can't say that he anticipated Assyrian influence. It is much easier to say that Ramesses III was a later date. And that's where I think it should be. In other words, what he is depicting here is his conflicts with the Assyrians. And that would put it around the 8th century BC. There's just one more thing that's rather interesting. Ramesses III has a palace, or had a palace, down in the delta at a place called Tel Yehuda. Now, some tiles were found there, if you please, and they also showed Persian influence, by the way. But on the back of the tiles, there were some Greek letters. Now, these Greek letters were intended so that they could put them all in the right place, you see. But the problem is, the Greek alphabet was not invented until 800 BC. And yet here is Ramesses supposed to be making these tiles 1200 BC. So I think all the evidence really points to the fact that this is Ramesses III fighting a battle with the Assyrians around about the 8th century BC. And as far as the sea peoples who are involved, well, the Assyrians simply conscripted the Phoenician navy and used them in their battles against the Egyptians. Well, we're just about down to the end of the history of ancient Egypt. We come down to the time of Pharaoh Hophra. He's mentioned in the biblical account in Jeremiah chapter 44 and in verse 30, where it says, "Behold, I'll give Pharaoh Hophra, king of Egypt, into the hand of his enemies." Hophra is to be identified with Pharaoh Apries, And this pharaoh left rather a cute sort of an obelisk that is today perched on the back of an elephant outside the Pantheon in Rome. The prophets of Israel were beginning to predict the doom of Egypt. Ezekiel 30 and verse 13 says, "I will also destroy the idols and cause the images to cease from Noph. There shall no longer be princes from the land of Egypt." Well, that's exactly what happened. The Persian invasion came in the 4th century BC, and Cambyses smashed this statue of Ramesses the Great here in Luxor. The great conqueror Alexander the Great came here 332 BC, and this relief shows him worshipping the god Amun. In the latter centuries came the Romans. Here, for instance, is Diocletian's pillar down there at Alexandria, sometimes referred to as Pompey's pillar. In the 7th century came the Islamic invasion, and finally we come down to the present state of the United Arab Republic of Egypt. And right down to the present time, there has never been a native prince in the land of Egypt over the last more than 2,000 years. And the idols have been smashed. Everything is just as the Bible says. So it seems the Bible knew what it was talking about.
What makes Egypt so exciting, I believe, is its ability to take you back in time to the glories of its long-lost past empire. An empire that was once nearly lost to the powerful Hittites. To find out more about this relief of Ramesses the Great fighting the Hittites, we take you in our next program to Turkey. There we'll be visiting the weird and wonderful world of Cappadocia, with its incredible underground cities and geological formations. Although they nearly succeeded in defeating the Egyptians, the Hittites were lost from history for thousands of years. The scholars even denied their very existence, until recently, that is. Don't miss this next exciting episode of Digging Up the Past, when David reveals the dramatic story of how the Hittites were found once again.